Chapter 1. Introducing Aunt Mary. The first time that Jack was threatened with expulsion from college, his Aunt Mary was much surprised and decidedly vexed, mainly at the college. His family were less surprised, viewing the young man through a clearer atmosphere than his Aunt Mary ever had, and knowing that he had barely escaped similar experiences earlier in his career by invariably leaving school the day before the Board of Inquiry convened. Jack's preparatory days had been more or less tempestuous. His family, Aunt Mary excepted, had expected some sort of afterclap when he entered college. Nevertheless, they had fervently hoped that it would not be quite as bad as this. Jack's sister Arethusa was visiting her aunt when the news came. Not because she wanted to, for the old lady was dreadfully deaf and fearfully arbitrary, but because Lucinda had said that she must go to her cousin's wedding, and the family always had to bow to Lucinda's mandates. Lucinda was Aunt Mary's maid, but she had become so indispensable as a sitter at the off end of the latter's ear trumpet that none of the grand-nephews or grand-nieces ever thought for an instant of crossing one of her wishes. So it was to Arethusa that the explanations due Aunt Mary's interest in her scapegrace fell, and she bowed her back to the burden with the resignation which the circumstances demanded. "Whatever is the difference between being expelled and being suspended?" Aunt Mary demanded, in her tone of imperious impatience. "Well, why don't you answer? I was brought up to speak when you're spoken to, and I'm a great believer in living up to your bringing up, if you had a good one. What's the difference, and which costs most? That's what I want to know. I do wish you'd answer me, Arethusa. There's 2 things I've asked you now, and you sucking your finger and putting on your thimble as if you were sitting alone in China." "I don't know which costs most," Arethusa shrieked. "You needn't scream so," said Aunt Mary. "I ain't so hard to hear as you think. I ain't but 70, and I'll beg you to remember that, Arethusa. Besides, I don't want to hear you talk. I just want to hear about Jack. I'm asking about his being expelled and suspended, and what's the difference, and in particular, if there's anything to pay for broken glass. It's always broken glass. That boy's bills for broken glass have been something just awful these last 2 years. Well, why don't you answer?" "I don't know what to answer," Arethusa screamed. "What do you suppose he's done, anyhow?" "Something bad." Aunt Mary frowned. "I ain't mad," she said sharply. "What made you think I was mad? I ain't mad at all. I'm just asking what's the difference between being expelled and being suspended, and it seems to me this is the 3rd time I've asked it. Seems to me it is." Arethusa laid down her work, drew a mighty breath, very nearly got into the ear trumpet, and explained that being suspended was infinitely less heinous than being expelled, and decidedly less final. Aunt Mary looked relieved. "Oh, then he's getting better, is he?" she asked. "Well, I'm sure that's some comfort." And then there was a long pause, during which she appeared to be engaged in deep reflection, and her niece continued her embroidery in peace. The pause endured until a sudden sneeze on the part of the old lady set the wheels of conversation turning again. "Arethusa," she said, "I wish you'd go and get the ink and write to Mr. Stebbins. I want him to begin to look up another college with good references right away. I don't want to waste any of the boy's life, and if being suspended means waiting while the college takes its time to consider whether it wants him back again or not, I ain't going to wait. I'm a great believer in a college education, but I don't know that it cuts much figure whether it's the same college right through or not. Anyway, you write Mr. Stebbins." Arethusa obeyed, and the authorities having seen fit to be uncommonly discreet as to the cause of the young man's withdrawal, no great difficulty was experienced in finding another campus whereupon Aunt Mary's pride and joy might freely disport himself. Mr. Stebbins threw himself into the affair with all the tact and ardor of an experienced legal mind, and soon after Lucinda's return to her home allowed Arethusa to follow suit, the hopeful younger brother of the latter became a candidate for his second outfit of new sweaters and hat bands that year. Aunt Mary wrote him a letter upon the occasion of his new start in life. Mr. Stebbins delivered him a lecture, and things went smoothly in consequence for 3 whole weeks. I say 3 whole weeks because 3 whole weeks was a long time for the course of Jack's life to flow smoothly. At the end of a fortnight, affairs were always due to run more rapidly, and 3 weeks produced, as a general thing, some species of climax. The climax in this case came to time as usual, his evil genius inciting the young man to attempt, one very dark night, the shooting of a cat which he thought he saw upon the back fence. Whether he really had seen a cat or not mattered very little in the latter development of the matter. He was certainly successful as far as the going off of the gun was concerned, but the damage that resulted not to any cat, but to the arm of the next door's cook, who was peacefully engaged in taking in her week's wash on the other side of the fence. The cook ceased abruptly to take in the wash. The affair was at once what is technically termed looked into, and 3 days later Jack became the defendant in a suit for damages. Naturally, Mr. Stebbins was at once notified, and he had no choice except to write Aunt Mary. Aunt Mary was somewhat less patient over the third escapade than she had been with the first 2. The letter found her alone with Lucinda as she read it to herself 3 times, and then read it aloud to her companion. Lucinda, whose thorough knowledge of the imperious will and impervious eardrums of her mistress rendered her, as a rule, extremely monosyllabic, not to say silent, vouchsafed no comment upon the contents of the epistle, and after a few minutes Aunt Mary herself took the field. "Now, what do you suppose possessed that boy to shoot at a cook?" she asked, regarding the letter with a portentous frown. "Cooks are so awful hard to get nowadays. I don't see why he didn't shoot a tramp if he had to shoot something." "He wasn't trying to shoot a cook, 'pears like," then cried Lucinda. Lucinda's voice, be it said en passant, was of that sibilant and penetrating timbre which is best illustrated in the accents of a steam-fitter's file. "'Pears like he was tryin' for a cat." "Not a bat," said her mistress correctively. "It was a cat. You look at this letter and you'll see. And anyway, how could a man shootin' at a cat hit a cook? Not 'less she was up a tree bird's nestin' after owl's eggs. You don't seem to pay much attention to what I read to you, Lucinda. Only I should think your common sense would help you out some when it comes to a boy you've known from the time he could walk, and a strange cook. But anyhow, that's neither here nor there. The question that bothers me is, what's to pay for this damage suit? I think myself $500 is too much for any cook's arm. A cook ain't in no such vital need of 2 arms. If she has to shut the door of the oven while she's stirring something on top of the stove, she can easily kick it with her foot. It won't be for long anyway, and I'm a great believer in making the best of things when you've got to." Lucinda screwed up her face and made no comment. Lucinda's face in repose was a cross between a monkey's and a peanut. Screwed up, it was particularly awful, and always exasperated her mistress. "Well, why don't you say something, Lucinda? I ain't asking your advice, but all the same, you can say anything if you've got a mind to." "I ain't got a mind to say anythin'," the faithful maid rejoined. "I guess you hit the nail on the head that time," said Aunt Mary, without any unnecessary malevolence concealed behind her sarcasm. Then she reread the note and frowned afresh. $500 is too much," she said again. "I'm going to write to Mr. Stebbins and tell him so tonight. He can compromise on 250 just as well as not. Get me some paper and my desk, Lucinda. Now get a spryness about you." Lucinda laid aside her work and forthwith got a spryness about her, bringing her mistress's writing desk with commendable alacrity. Aunt Mary took the writing desk and wrote freely for some time, to the end that she finally wrote most of the fierceness out of herself. "After all, boys will be boys," she said, as she sealed her letter, "and if this is the end, I shan't feel it's money wasted. I'm a great believer in bein' patient. Most always, that is. Here, Lucinda, you take this to Joshua and tell him to take it right to mail. Be prompt now. I'm a great believer in doin' things prompt." Lucinda took the letter and was prompt. "She wants this letter took right to the mail," she said to Joshua, Aunt Mary's longest tried servitor. "Then it'll be took right to mail," said Joshua. "She's pretty mad," said Lucinda. "Then she'll soon get over it," replied the other, taking up his hat and preparing to depart for the barn forthwith. Lucinda returned to Aunt Mary with a species of dried-up sigh. One is not the less a slave because one has been enslaved for 20 years, and Lucinda at moments did sort of peek out through her bars, possibly envying Joshua the daily drives to mail when he had full control of something that was alive. Lucinda had been, comparatively speaking, young when she had come to wait upon the pleasure of the Watkins millions, and her waiting had been so pertinent and so patient that it had endured over a quarter of a century. Aunt Mary had been under 50 in the hour of Lucinda's dawn. She was over 70 now. Jack hadn't been born then. He was in college now, and Jack's older brothers and sisters, and his dead and gone father and mother, had been living somewhere out west then, quite hopeful as to their own lives, and quite hopeless as to the stern old great aunt who never had paid any attention to her niece since she had chosen to elope with the doctor's reprobate son. Now the father and mother were dead and buried, the brothers and sisters reinstated in their rights, and had all grown up and become great credits to the old lady, whose heart had suddenly melted at the arrival of 5 orphans all at once. And there was only Jack to continue to worry about. Jack was not anything particularly remarkable. He was just one of those lovable good-for-nothings that seem born to get better people into trouble all their lives long. He had been spoiled originally by being 10 years younger than the next youngest in the family. And then, when the children had been shipped on to Aunt Mary's tender mercies, Jack had won her heart immediately because she accidentally discovered that he had never been baptized, and so felt fully justified in renaming him after her own father, and having the name branded into him for keeps by her own religious apparatus. It followed naturally that John Watkins Jr. Denham, for so her father's daughter had insisted that her youngest nephew should be called, was the favorite nephew of his aunt. And it was lucky for him that he was the favorite. For Aunt Mary, who was highly spiced at 50, became peppery at 60, and almost biting at 70. And yet for Jack she would sign checks almost without a murmur. Mr. Stebbins was much more censorious and impatient with the young man than she ever was, and to all the rest of the world Mr. Stebbins was an urbane and agreeable gentleman, whereas to all the rest of the world Aunt Mary was a problem or a terror. But Mr. Stebbins needed to be a man of tact and management, for he was the real manager of that fortune of which Mary, only surviving child of John Watkins, merchant and ship owner, was the legal possessor. And so tactful was Mr. Stebbins that he and his powerful client had never yet clashed, and they had been in close business relations for almost as many years as Lucinda had been established on the hearthstone of the Watkins home. Perhaps one reason why Mr. Stebbins endured so well was that he had a real talent for compromising, and that he had skillfully transformed Aunt Mary's inherited taste for driving a bargain into an acquired pleasure in what is really a polite form of the same action. So, when it came to the matter of Jack's difficulties, Mr. Stebbins could always find a halfway measure that saved the situation, and when he received the letter as to the cook and her claim, he hied himself to the city at once, and wrote back that the claim could be settled for $300. "And enough, I must say," Aunt Mary remarked to Lucinda upon receipt of the statement. $300 for one cat, for, after all, Jack blames the whole on the cat, and he didn't hit it even then. Lucinda did not answer. "But if the boy settles down now, I shan't mind paying the $3. Where are you going?" For Lucinda was walking out of the room. "I'm going to the door," she said raspingly. "The bell's ringing." After a minute or two she came back. "Telegram," she announced, handing the yellow envelope over. Aunt Mary put on her glasses, opened it, and read, "Cook has blood poison. Sues for $1,000. Probable amputation. Stebbins." Aunt Mary dropped the paper with a gasp. Lucinda looked at her with interest. "It's that same arm again," said Aunt Mary, "just as I thought it was settled for." Her eyes seemed to fairly crackle with indignation. "Why don't she put it in a sling and have a little patience?" Lucinda took the telegram and read it. "'Pears like she can't," she commented in a tone like a buzz saw. "'Pears like it's going to be took off." Aunt Mary reached forth her hand for the telegram, and after a second reading shook her head in a way that, if her companion had been a globe-trotter, would have brought Matadors and Seville to the front of her mind in that instant. "I declare," she said, "seems like I had enough on my mind without a cook, too. What's to be done now? I only know one thing. I ain't going to pay no $1,000 this week for no arm that wasn't worth but $300 last week. Stands to reason that there ain't no reason in that. I guess you'd better bring me my desk, Lucinda. I'm going to write to Mr. Stebbins, and I'm going to write to Jack, and I'm going to tell them both just what I think. I'm going to write Jack that he'd better be looking out, and I'm going to write to Mr. Stebbins that next time he settles things, I want him to take a receipt for that arm in full." The letters were duly written, and Mr. Stebbins, upon the receipt of his, redoubled his efforts, and did succeed in permanently settling with the cook, the arm being eventually saved. Aunt Mary regarded the sum as much higher than necessary, but still pleasantly less than that demanded of her, and so life in general moved quietly on until Easter. But Easter is always a period of more or less commotion in the time of youth, and leads to various hilarious outbreaks. Jack's Easter took him to town for a little time, and the little time ended in the station house at 3:00 on Sunday morning. Accusation: producing concussion of the brain on a cab driver. End of chapter 1.